Welcome to our presentation this evening of the New York Slavery Records Index. The purpose of the Slavery Index is to assemble a searchable index of records of slavery in New York. So rather than looking at the history of slavery in New York as a set of concepts or conflicts between important people, we're trying to look at it based upon evidence of what happened to individuals. So our goal is to deepen the historical documentation of slavery as it was conducted by and experienced by individuals. What we have is a database, and right now there's more than 36,000 records of slavery in New York State, which cover a period of more than, they cover a period from about 1525 up through the Civil War. And they can be searched based upon the name of the slave owner, or the name of the enslaved person, or a jurisdiction, or a kind of record. We point out here where our records came from. They come from census records, records of slave trade transactions, cemetery records, birth certifications and manumissions, ship inventories, private narratives, and legal records. Yeah, the database can be searched based upon, as I said, the name of an owner, a place name, a type of record, date ranges, and topical search tags. I'm now going to turn this over for a moment to Professor Judy-Lynne Peters, who is my co-investigator, co-researcher on this project, to explain how we've involved some students in the project.
Hi. When we began working on this project, I thought it was very, very important to involve students from the very beginning, because this is an issue that touches all of us. And when students began to see what we were doing, they got very excited about participating. In the past year, we've had about 14 students working with us. We had Tyresa Jackson, who coded the colonial records, which are thousands of handwritten records of slavery based upon the British censuses. Matt Thompson coded the New York City Census records. Julius Caranda has been looking at the addresses and locations of slave owners, so we had a better understanding of where slavery took place in the city. Erica Lawrenson coded upstate slave registrations, and so she was looking at slavery beyond New York City. Erica Martinez coded the names of slave ship owners and people who invested in slaves, bringing slaves into New York. Valencia McMillan has looked at, as she said, she followed the money and looked at governmental records of the slave trade. Colleen Mims coded slave registration records in Hempstead, Long Island. Laura Morales has coded Eastchester slave registrations and has found records for other places in upstate New York. Larissa Moran has been looking at Yorktown, which is also upstate. Segun Olaniyi is coding runaway slave registrations. Marta Orellana has been conducting a survey of towns to find out what materials they have. Daenerys Cabrera Pena is looking at slave announcements in the Hudson River Valley. And Peja Upsearch is looking at slave registrations and manumissions from the capital, Albany.
We have different types of records. We have census records that begin with the word census, and they're about population statistics for an area. Then we have enslaved person records, and that's a record, we've since renamed them to enslaved person records. It's a record that identifies an individual enslaved person, and owner records identify a record of an individual slave owner that documents enslavement generally. But our rule is if there's a name in the record of a particular enslaved person, it's an enslaved person record. The next People sometimes say, when did slavery begin? And typically the idea is that slavery in New York began in about 1623. We don't take that position. There was organized slavery soon after 1623 or 1625, but other sorts of enslavement occurred in New York before then, and we've recorded them. For example, one of the first explorers of the Hudson River in Manhattan was an explorer named Esteban Gomez, and he explored and mapped a series of river inlets and bays, including the Hudson River, which he called the Deep River. He was looking for a path to China, that if he went up the Hudson River, he could eventually go over and find China. That didn't work out, and so instead, he returned to Portugal with 59 indigenous persons to sell as slaves. Now, these are people we would call Native Americans, except there was no Americans. They were the people he found, and he figured, well, here's something we can bring back. And so he brought them back, and the King of Portugal was horrified, and I guess this was his mitigation. He handed them out. He didn't enslave them, but circulated them to various people that he knew to be house servants and gardeners and whatever. But they didn't get to go back to where they'd come from. They ended up being transported. Another person of significance is Jan Rodriguez in 1613. He was a crewman on the Dutch ship Young Tobias, which was one of the fleet of Magellan's ships. He split off from Magellan, and when the ship left what is today called Manhattan, he left one crew member named Jan Rodriguez behind, either because of a dispute or in order to signify that he possessed the site. And that, anyway, Rodriguez didn't regard himself as enslaved, but he was a mulatto man who was forced to work for his captain without compensation. That's kind of like enslavement. He was the first non-indigenous resident of what is now Manhattan, and he acted when he was there as a free man. He actually was a very impressive person who did a lot of trading and struck a lot of arrangements. But when I look for the origins of slavery in Manhattan, I think there's something about this situation that I think at least warrants looking at. Now we'll go back to Professor Peters.
Okay, this is a Dutch record of that proves ownership of slaves. The idea was, in order to prevent losing your slaves, people were forced to document and register their slaves by name. So in 1656, this man, Joan, actually Gallardo Ferrara, registered his slaves so that they could not be else. And we have lots of records of this type with people with slave registrations.
Another point to make about the Dutch records is that in the Dutch project, individuals didn't own the slaves, the company did. And so you were basically, it was like you were in the army and you were issued a slave. And so that's why they're asking them to document the slaves that they have. Colonial records.
Yes. So the colonial records were done when New York became a colony of the British. And again, they were asked to identify who their slaves were. So these people who are esquires, lawyers, are identifying the people in their households. They males, they have the females.
And this was done by a captain in the British military. And you'll notice up here the name Peter Delancey, Esquire. Well, the Delanceys are one of the big slaveholding families in New York. And this is the first First time we see that family in the records, but they are, they eventually had extensive holdings. Slave ship records. These are some colonial records of the port of New York. And what they show for 1715 to 1765 is all of the ships coming into New York that were delivering enslaved people to be sold. And what's interesting about the document, it identifies the date, the ship, the captain or master, the registration, the owners, the number of enslaved persons, and where it came from. And so, for example, this one says John Van Bro of New York. So what we've got there is we've identified an investor owner of a slave ship from New York. Now, you'll also notice, I'm not sure our viewers from afar can see this, but this is Anthony Rutgers. Rutgers. Now, that's an interesting. Where did I hear the name Rutgers before? I wonder whether there is something interesting here. Anyway, this is the source. This is a long, long document that was coded by one of our students. And so we are now able to say that we have a complete register of all of the slave owners, slave ship owners that delivered slaves during that 50-year period. And that is quite interesting, and you'll see a little later on, we're going to, well, actually right now. Right now. Interestingly enough, when we finally got the ship records together and proceeded to do some analysis, we asked one of our typical questions. Well, what's the story here for John Jay? And what we learned was that John Jay's grandfather invested in 11 slave ships, delivering a total of 108 slaves to the port of New York between 1717 and 1732. John Jay's father, Peter Jay, invested in 7 slave ships, delivering a total of 46 slaves to New York between 1730 and 1733. Now, they were, there were many, many investors and owners of these slave ships, but we're finding out something about our namesake, John Jay's extended family, and we'll be learning more about his extended family as the evening progresses. Now, we go on to the Treaty of Paris records. These are records. These are records that came out of the settlement of the Revolutionary War. At the end of the war, when the peace was negotiated, there was an agreement that the enslaved people who had run away from the colonists to fight on the side of the king could be allowed to emigrate to Canada, and that the colonist owners would receive compensation. And so there's a document called the Book of Negroes. It has a number of names, but in Canada, that's the name. It's also the name of a movie, which was actually made about it, but it's the actual original is about this document. This is the document that they filled out at the port when people got on the ships to go to Nova Scotia and to go to St. John's and various places in Canada. And so we have coded into our data set all of the enslaved people and slave owners from New York State. And we are sharing this with the Black Loyalist historical societies in Canada for their people. We know these people from our side of the ocean, and they know them from when they stepped off these boats and became Canadians. And they have family, and so we hope to learn a lot more about our New York enslaved people, and I'm sure they hope to learn more about what happened to them before they came. Now, once again, let's ask the John Jay question. Well, turns out we have a slave named Massey, age 22, who belongs to John Jay, Esquire. Now, he's in good company. I mean, we also had Harry Washington, and he belongs to General Washington. So on this list, we have the first president and the first Supreme Court Justice of the United States whose slaves ran away from them during the Revolutionary War to fight on the side of the king, and who got to emigrate to Canada. Now,
this is a piece of the U.S. Census from 1790, I believe.
I think I'll move over. Maybe not.
Okay, good. The important thing is to see this. Before the invention of typewriters, everything had to be recorded by hand. So this is a handwritten document, and we have actually copies of the entire thing. It listed the names of heads of family. It counted the people in the household and the number of slaves in each household. It doesn't identify them by individual names. We don't know genders. We just know the number of people who were enslaved in each household. They're very interesting records. The next slide shows that in 1790, John Jay's household had 5 slaves. In the next census, 1790 census was the first census taken by the United States government. The second census was in 1800. He still had 5 slaves. And by 1810, he was down to 1 slave, which is relevant because it sort of tracks his path towards manumission and eventually his role in eliminating slavery in New York State. The next slide, this is like the phone book of those days. So this is basically a directory of addresses. And we had several students work on this in New York City. Julius Caranda did it. He identified locations, addresses for various slaveholders, which gives us a sort of a sense of where enslaved people lived and, more importantly, what they did, because most of the people who were in Brooklyn were in agricultural situations. If they were in Lower Manhattan, they probably worked in manufacturing or in factories and businesses there. So we're getting a sense of where people were and what they were doing. We also did this upstate, and again, largely upstate, they were agricultural. The next record shows manumissions. And manumission is, so when someone turned a slave free, you had to document that process. And more importantly, it was important to give the enslaved person, a certificate or a document that shows he's been freed, and register that so that there is a record, since he probably couldn't read the record. That document was held by government as proof of that person's freedom.
Okay.
You can explain that
It
a
was
little more.
also, well, it actually was held in many instances by the Manumission Society of New York, which John Jay was a founder and the first president, and one of the ways in which it supported manumission was by being a repository for manumission certificates, because the people didn't always trust the government. That, you know, they thought maybe the government might lose it, or they might want to have a bribe or whatever. And the Manumission Society was an honest broker for these certificates. And if you didn't know where your certificate was, come on in, then the Manumission Society would have it. So that was one of the good things that John Jay did. We tell about some of the slavery that he did, but with the Manumission Society, he set up an organization that did that, and we'll get into some other things it did as well. Next. Records of trials. Now, we're going to be, right now, most of our records are older records. We're going to be doing a project to get records in the period leading up to the Civil War of trials where fugitive slaves were defendants. But this is a trial in 1741. This document is the New York Conspiracy or History of the Negro Plot, with the Journal of Proceedings against the Conspirators at New York in the year 1741. And so this was a trial of that resulted from 10 fires blazing in the city in April in 1741. And so more than 100 slaves, more than 100 enslaved persons were charged with a conspiracy to ignite the city on fire. And this is the actual transcript of the trial. You're getting what the clerk wrote about what everybody said. And so what we did is we've coded up all of the enslaved persons who were tried. We've documented what happened to them. We've been able then to identify who the slave owner was. They'll tell their age. They tell some other things about them. It turns out that there were 13 slaves were burned at the stake, and about an equal number were hung, and about 70 others were sold south, meaning that they were shipped to the Caribbean, to sugar plantations, which was being an enslaved person is bad enough. Being an enslaved person in a sugar plantation is really bad. Anyway, one of the slaves was a slave named Brash, who belonged to John Jay's father, Peter Jay. And so we've identified another slave in the Jay family. Now, this was before John Jay was born. After this, he has absolutely nothing to do with this, but this was a really, I won't read through it, but some of the testimony is extraordinary, because they believed that if someone wasn't telling the truth that you wanted to hear, that torture was a good way to get it, and that people were generally very truthful just before they were burnt at the stake. And so it's a very depressing document to read, but it's part of our history of slavery in New York. Next, we have another kind of records of purchases of slaves and sales of slaves. Now, this one is an interesting document because this is in Taconic in 1823. And it is a sale for a black woman named Flora, and also for Simon, her son, about 3 years old. Well, in 1823, you couldn't sell Simon, her son, because you could. It was not legal. Be quite old to actually be. I'll explain later about the gradual abolition law, but I think that this particular transaction is completely illegal. Illegal for the woman being traded and illegal for her child. Next.
This is a copy of a runaway notice. Very often, you have to think about this. Enslaved people were treated as commodities. It's like having a car, something else of value. And if you lost it, you obviously wanted to get it back. And so people would put out ads in newspapers and other publications. And these are two examples of runaway notices. These are interesting because they tell us more about the people we're talking about, people we're studying, because it gives descriptions, his name, height, age, things about their lives. Very often we're just dealing with names, so we're actually beginning to see people emerge out of this list of names and take on some characteristics of humanity. And we've been documenting these, and in the database, you can actually take a look at these actual ads.
Okay, next we're looking at birth registration and abandonment records. And we're telling you, just to orient you, we're going through the different kinds of records that there are to assemble a database that gives you a list of the names of a lot of people who were slaveholders and a lot of people who were enslaved. So these are basically birth certificates, and they were required by the 1799 law that was the gradual abolition law. The first one over on the left side describes the birth of a certain female child named Phoebe, was born to a slave named Hannibal, and Mr. Haynes says that he's going to retain the child according to law. And I will explain that in a minute. But you can imagine this was a woman has a baby, and the owner says, yes, I'm going to retain this child according to law. But it gets worse. On the right side is one where John Coles of the city of New York certifies that Isabella, the child Isabella was born of her woman slave named Peggy, which child I abandon according to law. Now, what does that mean? We'll go to the next slide. The gradual abolition law was the law ending slavery that was signed by John Jay when he was governor. Now, this is a law which John Jay said wasn't the law he wanted, it was the law he could get. John Jay tried to abolish slavery in the New York Constitution when it was being drafted in 1877. He got a group of people to propose that, and it didn't pass and wasn't in the Constitution. He tried various things with the Manumission Society. He passed a law in making it illegal to move an enslaved person across state lines for the purpose of selling them. So he did a number of things as president of the Manumission Society to attempt to abolish slavery, but when he became governor in the 1790s, he did a law to abolish slavery. And it didn't get out of committee in the Senate. Now, we can explain why with our research. We took the names of the senators and we ran them through our database, and a strong majority of the senators in New York in 1790 and 1800 were slaveholders. So I can imagine, it's true in the assembly, I can imagine John Jay saying to the senators, let's abolish slavery, and I can see them saying, we have a committee for that. And so what kind of a law can John Jay get to abolish slavery that a majority of slaveholders would vote for? And the answer is one that changes things very slowly. So in our health care insurance, we talk about pre-existing conditions. This is a law that ended slavery with a giant pre-existing condition. It didn't apply to you if you were enslaved. It only applied to your children. But furthermore, it applied to your children, a girl child after she did 25 years of slave-like service, and 28 years for a male child. So what's going on in those records that I showed you is that on the one side, the man was claiming that child for 25 years of slave-like service. So that for that, senator who voted to keep for this bill, nothing changed. Eventually, this bill made all the difference in the world, but immediately it didn't change anything. But the abandonment one, some of the slave owners said, well, wait a minute, you passed this law and we raised these children and then they are they don't have value to us anymore. You're stealing our property. And so the law said that you could abandon the baby and the state would consider the baby to be like a pauper, and the baby would be in the care and the custody of the of social services of the town or county that you were in. So in that previous slide, the mother has the baby, and the owner says, yep, but that baby's going to go to the government and be put up for foster care. Now, yeah, this is more about the part about the person entitled to such service may nevertheless elect to abandon his or her right to such service by notification, in which case every child abandoned shall be considered as paupers of the respective town or city. And the state agreed to pay $3 a day, or $3 a month, for care of these babies. And so we've got these other registrations where people will say, you know, it'll be like an inn, and the inn will say it's got seven black children. Well, that's because they're doing this. However, we also had some forensic accountants go to work on our project, and they were looking at comptroller's documents about these transactions, and have they got we have a comptroller's report we need to file. Turns out that by 1799, well, by 1802, this was using 3% of the state's budget to pay for all this. By 1805, it was using 6% of the state's budget to pay for all this. And so the comptroller went to the legislature and said, can you afford to do this? You know, and they of course, they had said they would pay for the care of the abandoned children. Well, they decided, no, we can't afford to pay for the care of the abandoned children anymore, so we'll stop paying for it. But nevertheless, people can continue to abandon the children, and the towns will have to pay for it.
The other part of it is that when the children were abandoned, they more often than not stayed with the original slave owner. So the slave owner abandoned his kid and then got paid $3 a month.
That's what happened later. Yeah, that's...
Well, it was happening as early as 1802.
Okay, because it's really happening a lot later on.
It became more and more.
Next slide is yours.
Well, I think you've covered most of this. The real challenge in trying to change the law was that the people who were made responsible for changing the law were heavily invested in the status quo, right? So why would you want to abandon slavery when your household depended upon slave labor? So pretty much the decision was made to create a gradual law that essentially ensured that through the lifetime of the legislators, they would have their slaves, and that it would gradually be abandoned. So anybody who had slaves continued to have them, which is why we have documents that show people enslaved into the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s. It only affected people who were born new, and as I said before, very often the people who were born period ended up in slavery, but they weren't freed at all. Making a face.
Next one.
Okay.
Next one is cemetery.
Yeah. In addition to looking at the lives of people, we looked at the deaths of people. This one's a little harder to get concrete information on because, as a matter of practice, any people of color were not buried in regular cemeteries. So whether you were enslaved or free, you were put into a black cemetery or an African cemetery. Consequently, we've been compiling records of slaves or slave persons and black people. We don't know for sure if people were slaves or not, but we do have lots of cemetery records. I would say the majority of them are children because children routinely died within 5 years of birth. But we also have people who sometimes the records say they're slaved. Sometimes it just says this person was born this year, this person died that year, and they're buried here.
Great, but I think that, can we go back to that one just for a sec? What I think is interesting here is that they they went to the trouble of naming an enslaved person where they knew the name.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're trying to do. That's one of our objectives. If we accomplish nothing else, we'd like to have as many names of these enslaved people because it's real. You know, if we keep counting, if we think of slavery as 8 of these and 4 of these and the plantation of this, we want to remember the individual. And that's, you know, and I think that this is exactly what they're doing in that sign, but we're doing it, you know, with new technology, we're doing it statewide.
It's very true. A lot of people, they have full names, and some people they have no name for. It just says a man, you know, or a Negro child. But in a lot of cases, the people have names, sometimes only one name, but a lot of times it's the first time you identify someone, you know, probably the only time in their lives they were really recognized as an individual in that way.
Okay. Now, financial records. You know, I said that we wanted to look at the financial records. I mean, that helps us to understand a lot as to follow the money. But if we go back to the idea that we're also interested in getting the names of the slaveholders and getting the names of their slaves, they're in the financial records. In order to get the compensation from the state, they had to say whose enslaved child was being paid for and where was the enslaved child. And so these are those documents. And one of our students, she and I went up to Albany and we got the comptroller. The comptroller's office said they didn't know where these were. And we tracked them down and we scanned them and we've digitized them and we put them online so that anybody can download them forever. And it's something that I think, you know, is part of what we're trying to do here. Now, personal records. This happens to be a letter from Peter J. to James and Johnny. Now, you know who Johnny is. That's John J. That's our John J. And this is Peter J. is the guy that invested in the slave ships and had the slave named Brass that was shipped after that conspiracy. So when we throw all the records up into this large data set, we can begin to see a story about people because we see their birth date, we see when this happened, when that happened. We can begin to say that we're starting to know someone. And so the more we can put up about a slave owner, the more we can put up about an enslaved person, the more we can begin to build a narrative that gives the whole experience of slavery for the people who experienced it as enslaved persons, humanity. Now we think in that book of Negroes, in that register, I said that it was a slave named Massey, yes. Some people think Massey is Frank because the time is about right. But it's also possible that John Jay had 2 slaves, but since we think there was only one, and they didn't actually list one that belonged to John Jay's father. So we don't have any other Massey in the entire data set. And so we think that this guy and that guy may be the same, and we're going to tell that to the Canadians, that if they can't locate someone, you know, it might be Frank. Next, the Louisiana slave trade data set. This is another state where they're setting up a big database, not as big as ours. But what they've done is they put into a single big database all of the county records of slave trades in Louisiana, where they had these plantations. And so we got the data set and we stuck it on our computers and we started to grind away. And we found records of people in their data set, 10 persons who identified that they were born in New York. Well, how are you in the Louisiana slave trade database if you were born in New York? So these are some people that we really want to try and figure out how did this happen? You know, we'd really like to trace back what might have happened. And so they're interesting people. It's like the 12 Years a Slave book, but more examples of it. Next.
One of the interesting things in our database is Sojourner Truth's record, because she was enslaved in New York. She has quite a history that's known. Unlike most enslaved persons, her history is known because she wrote an autobiography. And so, because of her documentation of her history, we're able to make all the connections. We can identify her owners, we can identify people she talks about in her story, and because there's a lot of research on her, we can trace her family to current day. So we actually have a search tag for Sojourner Truth. The other thing we're doing is, because each of the students who has been working with us this past year has tried to put together a biography of an enslaved person, is we're beginning to be able to find several references to a person and begin to create histories. So as we build this database, we'll hope to be able to create more stories and know more about the backgrounds and more about what happened, what became of people, particularly people who left New York and went up to Canada, what happened to them. We can make connections, we can begin to tell their stories.
And she's the only person thus far where we can do a really, really longitudinal picture. I mean, we think we have the ship that her mother arrived on. We have a slavery record of her mother. We have her slavery record. We have a whole series of sales of her. And then we have her after she was emancipated. We have her living in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and we have her in the United States Census. And in Grand Rapids, Michigan, there is a Sojourner Truth Historical Society. And they have traced the ancestry of people, so they can identify a person from 1920 that is a son or a grand or is a relative. It's the first time that we can take it all the way from a slave ship in the 1700s all the way through to people who are alive today. And several years ago, they went to visit President Obama. So I think Sojourner Truth would be pleased to know that her family kind of made some progress. Next, okay. Now, the question is, did slavery end in New York in 1927? Most of the books will tell you it ended in 1827. Sorry, most of the books will say it ended in 1827 because that was the day when the law in 1717 that said that the people who hadn't been freed in 1799 were freed in 1827. And so there is an emancipation by law that happened then, but the question is, what happened to the children born to slave mothers after 1799? If you were born in 1820 and you had to do 25 years of slave-like service, you were going to be doing that until 1845. And so slavery didn't end for you in 1827. Similarly, slave ships could stop in New York, in the port of New York Harbor, with the slaves inside and stay in the harbor for up to 9 months. Now, they wouldn't. I mean, they'd move on. But the harbor served slave ships. And so, you know, this was an area where there was slavery going on in the community. It just wasn't owned by individuals anymore. And slaves could be transported through New York by their owners. And finally, fugitive slaves were easily captured in New York. And there were lots of people who were in New York solely for the activity to try to capture people who'd run away from the South.
And they also captured people who weren't runaways.
Right, like the 12 Years a Slave guy. So, yes, the Underground Railroad. Obviously, it wasn't a subway, but in the period after the emancipation, after the 1827 and the Civil War, slavery was a topic in New York, and it was happening in New York because people were escaping from the South. They were being captured in New York City, and they were being returned. And so we have one record of almost 200 cases from a document at Columbia that is a record of a 2-year record of a person who was a point of contact for slaves escaping from the South. They would come to Richard Sidney Howard Gay, and he would then send them to various places and people to help them. He sent a lot of people to Syracuse, sent a lot of people to Albany, sent people to various places. And so this was the Freedom Train. There were very interesting legal cases, and we'll get into some of them. There were reports of committees explaining, you know, giving names of people who were being apprehended, and they were being taken up before these tribunals to be sent back south, and the newspapers reported on it. The next one, Richard Riker. Richard Riker was the recorder of New York City and presided over the Court of Special Sessions during the years that I showed here, basically 1815 to 1838 on and off. And he was associated with what was called the New York Kidnapping Club. Now, basically, their slogan was, arrest and send any black back to the South. And what would happen is that the way that this court worked is if the standard of proof as far as Richard Riker was concerned is if the person presented to him resembled the person described by the slave owner in the South, that was good enough. You know, and since all black people look alike, most of them was good enough for him. He was basically known for quick certificates of removal. The people that were like private investigators that were sent up to New York City would look around, find someone who looked like what the person was that they were looking for, drag them into this thing. Richard Riker would give it the stamp of approval, and they would be on the cart back down south, and they would be as lost as the guy in 12 Years a Slave. You know, they could be someone who, you know, I mean, they could be anybody, and they end up being caught up this way. Now, Richard Riker, it is said that Riker's Island is named after him. I don't actually think so, but we want to look into it a bit more. I think it was named after someone much earlier than him.
Well, the island was owned by the family that is part of his family. They owned the island for several years. But I mean, I looked at this.
His ancestral family.
Yeah. Some people claim that Riker's Island was named after him, and they're outraged about it. But it seems as though his family has owned the island since 1739, until they sold it to the city. And so it became known as Riker's Island before that. And they built a correctional facility on the island rather than created Riker's Island and created the facility in order to, you know, name it after him.
But you know, I think if they want to say that it's named after the family that was originally the owner of Riker's Island, I think we ought to go back to the old spelling. I mean, that I think would be a compromise that's consistent with what that family is saying about the island. We're just going to give it the original Dutch spelling and get away from any possible impression that this guy is. Now, it gets us next to John J.
You should tell this story.
I will. John J. 2. Now, this is John Jay's grandson. Okay, so I call him John Jay version 2.0. His son, John Jay's son, William, was a lawyer and was an advocate for, okay, good. All right, good. Anyway, John Jay II was his son. John Jay II became an attorney, and if you're not happy with John Jay the first as a fierce advocate for justice, I'll give you John Jay II, because he was absolutely, definitely the real thing. He was one of a handful of lawyers who would take on cases for fugitive slaves, and he would do it for free. I mean, his family was wealthy. He would take on these cases for free. And I'll tell you the story of one of them. This is the case of George Kirk. George Kirk was an enslaved person. Probably he really did come up from the South. He probably really did escape from slavery. Good for him. He hid on a ship that went from Georgia to New York and was caught escaping the ship in New York. And the ship captain put him in chains. Well, then they brought the ship in to offload some of the other materials on the ship. And the New York City dock workers heard him howling and reported on the situation to Sidney Howard Gay, the guy that did the list. It's the same guy. And Gay engages John Jay II. John Jay II files a writ to bring Kirk to court. And so they get him, and then he's brought to a judge. And the captain says that Kirk admitted to being a fugitive. Well, of course, they don't allow Kirk to testify because that's the rules of these courts. And so one of the things John Jay said was that if you won't allow my client to testify, you can't allow in testimony of someone else about what he said. And the judge agreed. But furthermore, John Jay argued that no person in New York can imprison another person. And that this captain, there was no law. He wasn't the owner. He was just the captain. And he couldn't imprison one of his crewmates on his ship. He had no right to imprison this man, and the judge agreed. So John Jay II wins it thus far. So Kirk is escorted to Sidney Howard Gay's office by a sympathetic and cheering crowd. There was a crowd that came to this. The emancipation groups would always kind of gin up people to come to all the trials. The ship captain contacts New York City Mayor Mickle. Now, the mayors went on and off in terms of their attitudes about slaves, but Mickle was he wanted to get rid of them. So Mickle directs the police to go after and apprehend Kirk, because Mickle wants to bring him to a different court, a court that was more like Mr. Riker's court, a friendlier court. So John Jay encourages, at the Gay office, encourages a black office worker to climb into an American Bible Society crate. And they bring the crate down, put it on a horse-drawn cart, and send the cart down the road really fast. And it's sort of like the OJ. The police are suddenly they're following this cart down the road, and they finally apprehend the cart down the road, and they open up the cart, and this guy stands up, and he's just, I was going for a ride in the cart. And so then George Kirk escapes out the back door and is taken to Boston by some of the people that are in the emancipation group. And 30 years later, George Kirk is still working as a shoemaker in Boston. He became a free man and practiced his trade as a shoemaker and was rescued by John Jay. And so, that's why I say he's a fierce advocate for justice. Now, the next we have here is the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. Well, with this kind of stuff going on, the southern states were getting kind of ticked off. They pointed out that the Constitution says, it no longer says this because of the slavery was abolished, but the Constitution had a fugitive slave clause in the United States Constitution that said no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on the claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. In the Constitution of the United States. I mean, like the Bill of Rights, it's just right there. So the southern states and some sympathetic states proposed an 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, which set federal, not state and local jurisdiction for the return of fugitive slaves. Now, if you think about it, what was the Civil War about? This was about the southern states not wanting the federal government to tell them how to do their business. But in 1850, they were all ready to tell the northern states how to do their business. They have the federal government. So they wanted the federal government to come in and nullify New York's laws and take over and run that aspect of life in the state. Okay? On the other side, the northern states said, oh, no, we have the right to nullify a bad part of the Constitution. We only have to follow the good parts of the Constitution. Seems to me we hear that argument during the Civil War, on the other side. But basically, Wisconsin, for example, a court nullified this part of the federal Constitution for Wisconsin. That was exactly what the Civil War was about, but everybody's on the other sides in this particular situation. Now, the law was very interesting. It required that if a slave escaped from a southern state, came up to the north, came up to New York, owners or agents had to locate and seize the fugitive. In other words, you just sent your private investigator up, and the investigator located and with a couple people seized that person and tied him up in the hotel room. I mean, there was no protections whatsoever, no due process. They just came in, swooped you up. They didn't tell family. They didn't do anything. They just tied you up. These could also be authorized by local authorities, like Mayor Mickle would say, hey, go help. The alleged fugitive was never permitted to testify in trial. The idea was that the fugitive would lie, and so what's the use? So they wouldn't allow the fugitive to testify at trial, and the standard of proof literally was that the alleged fugitive resembles the owner's description of the fugitive slave. So, looks about the right size. Yeah, this is the guy. You're gone. Now, the other thing is that the judges were paid by the case. And the rate was that you were paid $5 if there was an acquittal. But if you found in favor of the owner, you were paid $10. I mean,
Guess what?
But there wasn't any conflict of interest here. It's just that the judge was rewarded for finding against you. I mean, you don't make this up, I mean, it's like, I mean, it's just, but it was a real law. It was signed by President Millard Fillmore, and it was the craziest law. So anyway, now
I think it's important to mention that even though many states in the North were for abolition of slavery, they were not in favor of having black people around. They basically said, "We'll free you, get out of here." And so the climate was such that, I mean, there's a lot of outrage about the courts, but the climate was, well, if they disappear, it's not our problem, So, you have to understand that abolition of slavery did not mean that you were now welcome to society in a lot of places to escape and to go away.
Okay, now, the next field, I will direct you to the site. Now, at the beginning of the show, we did show the site, and at some point we'll go back to it. But there's documentation on the website that shows you all the fields that you can search on. Then we have what are called tags. We've got 2 pages of tags here. Tags are sort of canned searches. They're searches that we've already sort of prepared for you. So for example, if you want to see the book of Negro slaves, the New York slaves, you just put in the tag BON and you'll get the list. If you want to see the Louisiana slave trade people, you put in the LSTD and you'll get that list. Similarly for Sojourner Truth's biography. All the slave owners and all the people that she refers to in her book, in her biography, you can just put the code in and we'll show you our records about them. RAN means that it's a runaway. And so you'll see the runaway slave ads if you do that. ABN, these are abandoned babies. So all the baby abandonments, you can see all of the owners that made that choice that the child would be abandoned. Sale is a slave trade. EMN is an emancipation. Cemetery means this is a cemetery marker. SEN is the code for the senators. So you can see, like SEN 1800 means that this is a senator who was a slaveholder in the Senate. More tags on the next page. The JAY gets you slavery, everybody having to do with the extended family of John Jay. All the way from the slave ships, all the way through to John Jay 2. We've got John Jay 2 because we have a kind of record now that we have a record for advocates. And so we're showing where someone actually did something immediately and individually helpful to an enslaved person. And so John Jay 2 will often appear there. But we have people who we'll see slave sale contracts where the person said, I bought this slave and I hereby now emancipate the slave. Meaning that the person paid the slave owner for the slave and then said, you're done and you're emancipated. And so this was somebody doing something that was an advocate. INVNY means it's a New York slave investor. So you can see all the investors in New York slavery. INVI means it's not a New York. It means these are people from Europe and from the Caribbean and from other places. House identifies a property. It'll typically be a census record naming a person and a number of slaves in a place, and we'll have the address of the house because the house still exists. And so this will become a list of all of the houses and buildings where slaves ever lived that still exist. Now that's when I say there's more to be done here. That's what we're talking about. There's lots of historical research that needs to be done. CMPT means it's a record of the comptroller's office. DESC means it's a descendant. We're trying to get early descendants of people who've been freed. So that if someone's doing a genealogical search for family, if they can find that person, they know they can go all the way back. We can take them the rest of the way. And so anyway, we have one where we show somebody who's an advocate and also a record of a legal case. We expect to have a student who has a law degree who's going to be identifying legal cases where fugitive slaves were defendants and other slaves were defendants, because those cases will show us who the owners were and so on and so forth. So it's one more of getting that fabric of all those lives. Now, I'm going to give you a brief demonstration, and then we'll open it up for questions. So I'm going to step away. You'll hear my voice, but you're not going to hear my, and I'm going to show what happens. Select J, the extended family of John Jay, and we click on search. Here they all are. Here are all the records that we have, starting with Augustus J. And this is a vessel called the Jamaica, bringing 4 slaves in. Then we have Augustus J. 1725. 8 slaves coming in on a ship called the Mary. And so, you know, we're going way back, and then we move the other older. And here's a slave named Lewis, and here's a slave named Maul. And in each of these records, I can show you where you can, well, actually, in all of these, we have an essay called Slavery in the Extended Family of John Jay, and that provides the citations to the literature and the records for these enslavements. But if we go back, now we go back to, let's go to, say, here's the New York State Senators in 1790. There they are. These are the senators who were the slaveholders in 1790. These are the people who were responsible for not passing a better slavery law. You know, these are exactly. So with that, I'm going to close our presentation. Thank you very, very much, and thank you, Professor Peters.